The session today, as Tim was saying, touches upon, I guess, what you could describe as the third rail of the topic of technology. As we introduce Internet of Things, automation, AI, et cetera, what are we going to have? Are we going to have higher productivity, therefore higher wages, and more and better jobs? Or are we going to have a hollowed out middle class, disrupted families, and potential chaos in our society? Which is it going to be, or is it going to be some combination of both, is a very interesting debate. We've seen evidence of the good and bad already. Automation has eliminated some of the more dangerous and backbreaking work. It's also taken out routine tasks from other jobs, giving people a chance to work on things that are more interesting, higher value, and potentially more meaningful. But on the other hand, we've seen plants go from having hundreds or dozens of people to having one person in front of a computer screen, and possibly tomorrow having no one sitting in front of that computer screen. The prior wave of industrial automation after the Second World War, if we can take some lessons from that, the Sparrows Point facility, the Bethlehem Steel in Baltimore, in 1961 it produced 700,000 tons of steel using 33,000 people. 40 years later, less than one working lifetime, there were 5,000 people producing 3 million tons of steel. That's a 30-fold productivity increase, but it's also 28,000 disrupted families in the city of Baltimore. If anything, that was 1960 to 2000. Now, the pace of change is accelerating. We saw that in our presentations earlier today. Processing power is, for all intents and purposes, free. Sensors are good and they're cheap. Bandwidth with 5G is virtually free now too. And the ability to code is getting faster, cheaper, and more accessible to everybody. The challenge for us as managers is what are we going to do with this? How are we going to adjust our businesses, adjust our labor policies, adjust our social policies in order to make the best of this challenging and high opportunity situation? I would argue, and I think we could debate, that how we as managers deal, and investors and owners deal with this challenge could be the defining moral and corporate social responsibility issue of our business generation. So in order to dig into this situation a little deeper, we have a panel that I will introduce to you now. And I'll ask each of them to respond to an aspect of this. And there is time for questions. If there is time for questions on your app, please enter them in, and I'll moderate them from up here. And here we go. So immediately to my left is Jerry Dias. Jerry is the president of Unifor, which is Canada's largest private sector labor union. To his left is Amar Hanspal. Amar is the CEO of Bright Machines. You heard of that company earlier this afternoon. It's a company that applies AI-powered software to bring intelligence and automation to manufacturing. To his left is Sheila Gulati. Sheila is founder and manager of Tola Capital, which is a venture firm investing in the enterprise software space. And to her left is Scott Gebicke. Scott is the global head of the Energy, Industrial, and Building Group at Jabil, which is a manufacturing services provider. So let's get started first. I'll go to the end of the line here and ask Scott to help us get a little more specific about what we mean by this term automation. Can you lay out for us your way of thinking about that?
Sure. Am I on? Am I good? Sure. I think one of the first things is you talked a lot about the steel industry, and I think most of the process automation stuff has been done a long time ago, and it was mostly done for safety reasons. If you think about oil and gas refineries, if you think about steel mills, a lot of that's been done. So what we're really talking about is discrete automation. It's building specific things, specific products. And then if you play that forward a little bit, you think about anything with long product life cycles, with huge capital returns, things like automobiles, and more recently things like batteries. That's been heavily manufactured because the economic case is so clear, because of the length of the investment and the return on the investment is very clear. So really you're left with what is a tale of products that either have very short product life cycles, meaning the investment of scale isn't there, or it's a high mix in different type of product, and you need to figure out how to configure it to order it. So there's a couple things in automation that are general things, I think, just to scope it. The first is what I'll call cobots. And cobots are robots that can actually work alongside people to supplement tasks, either for speed, productivity, or quality. The two big advancements in cobots recently are, one, the programming time. I think some of them can be programmed in under 10 minutes. Just by people who don't even know code. You just move the robots in a certain way and they'll do it. And second is a safety aspect. They've come out with robots that are safe to interoperate with humans, that it won't injure a human next to them. These have been a pretty big advancement because it allows you to take an automation of a specific part of a process and then pull it out and then reprogram it and put it somewhere else. So the versatility is pretty incredible. And then the third one is actually when the human is actually doing the operation. And these are either artificial intelligence or controls or sensors to check that the human's either doing things correctly. A couple examples of that are, it's fairly complex, but if you look at of tuning a telco antenna, either for 3G or something like that, there's a series of 1,000 screws or so that you've got to do in a specific sequence to get the right frequency. That used to take hours upon hours upon hours of kind of trial and error. With algorithms, you can automate that and highlight which screw has to be turned and how much with a torque wrench, and you can cut that down to a matter of minutes. The second one is for quality control or productivity. You can actually be videoing a human set of interactions for a specific product. And all you have to do is program the hand movements in correctly. And it will flag when a hand movement was missed or something was done incorrectly. And I think if you look at those three things, you look at one, full automation, the cobots, and then the human factor automation, which I'll call the third. That's a good way to think about how you can attack the problem.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Scott, for those introductory comments. Amar, maybe I'll turn to you next, and if you wouldn't mind, tell us what you see coming down the pike here. What are we going to need to be dealing with?
So I think automation is accelerating. I think the first generation of automation was largely hardware driven, and things that have started to change, you heard about sensors and AI. I think the biggest change we're seeing in computing now is that we finally have machines that have eyes and brains. And so the application of a software layer to automation is really going to add, where machines had muscles, now you can have eyes and brains, and that is going to, I know it sounds dramatic, but what is really going to dramatically change is the economics and speed of deployment of automation. I think hardware-based automation was costly, it took too long, and it required human experts. And the more this stuff becomes put into software, the cheaper it is going to be to automate, the faster it's going to be to automate and scale and replicate around the world. So the pace of automation is going to just accelerate. And it's necessary because I would say manufacturing had one big step function in the last 30 years, and that was globalization, where you learn to leverage large labor pools in low-cost countries. And I think the next big step function is automation. And it's necessary because the demand for products is increasing all around the world as you have this growing middle class, and people need more medical products, they need smart cars and smartphones, and you simply don't have the capacity using the current approach, or you're running out of capacity using the current approach. And so automation and this acceleration is both inevitable and necessary. But it is going to lead to the thing that I think your panel is touching on, which is it's going to change the nature of the workforce in at least three dramatic ways that I see. One, the nature of factories is going to change as a result. So instead of these large, centralized factories, you're going to have much more distributed, networked factories around the world that are more energy efficient, can build products on demand, and I think they'll have some implications on local economies that are positive. I'm an optimist, by the way, so that's one. Second, I think the nature of work starts to change in terms of automation. So what happened was the farm to factory movement is now going to go factory to frontline. Forget artificial intelligence, all the result of increasing automation is always to redefine work. And you saw this happen in the banking industry when ATMs showed up. You're seeing it happen in the retail industry. You go to your local Best Buy, it's already the people there are different. They are trying to solve problems with you. So I think it's going to go from factories to frontline, where people are going to start trying to solve problems for customers as opposed to do repetitive tasks. I think that's the second big change you're going to see as a result of automation going on. And the combination of the more automation, distributed factories, a engaged sort of frontline that is letting you work with factories in a less mysterious way, I think is going to lead to more innovation, that manufacturing will stop being a black art to all the engineers and designers of the world who've generally found it difficult to get product into factories. And I think we're going to find the same sort of renaissance we saw in the software industry, where the arrival of the App Store suddenly exploded the number of people that could write software. I think we're going to see a huge number of people get more comfortable deploying physical products into factories. And I think that third consequence of innovation is is another aspect of automation. So I'm a net, I think everything's going to change. It's going to feel a little wobbly, but it's going to change for the better.
So it's sort of like having children.
Yeah, exactly.
Let's bring this.
I like that definition, actually, and I like the concept that we're allowing software and data to transform the way that we work now. And we often talk about the fourth paradigm of computing, which was coined by the late, great data scientist Jim Gray. And so you had empirical sort of processing and kind of methods of scientific reasoning. Then you went into theoretical, into computational. And we like to spend a lot of time thinking about what does being data-driven mean for organizations, for industry. And really, it's allowing the data and the software to take us on a journey and to tell us that story. So we don't even know anymore all the questions that we should be asking. We should be understanding the patterns in the information that are already available to us through our manufacturing capacity, through other elements, and then being able to really follow those patterns down and get to a state of greater automation. And we think that that is actually an incredibly positive thing for both industry and workers alike.
Thank you, Sheila. Jerry, I'd like to make this conversation, bring it back down to the personal a little more, and what's going to happen with the people who work with us and our societies and our communities. Your organization represents hundreds of thousands of families in communities all across North America. And I'm wondering, how is your organization thinking about this? What are you planning for?
Well, we have 315,000 members in Canada, representing workers in the 20 largest economic sectors. So I want to take it back to what the focus of the panel is. Look at the title. Will the workers be smarter, or will there be no workers at all? If we live in an environment with no workers, first of all, I don't know how any of you stay in business. That's number one. Number two, what does it do as it relates to social and economic chaos? Because I will argue that so much of this is already playing out. I take a look at some of the global challenges, and I take a look at how workers are responding when there's this general feeling of helplessness. If you take a look at Brexit, take a look at some of the movements that are happening, I will argue in Europe, whether or not it's in Germany, Ukraine, Greece, talking about workers mobilizing under some pretty aggressive banters, white nationalists. Why? Because I will argue that people are feeling incredibly frustrated today. And that's how they strike out. So if I start to take it back to the basics, dealing with technology isn't a new debate. You're right, the focus of the change today is unprecedented. It's modern, it's aggressive, but this is nothing new. I mean, I want to raise to me what is symbolic that goes back to the whole argument with Henry Ford II and Walter Reuther. And we all know the debate that happened in the 50s. When Walter Reuther walked through the Detroit assembly plant with Henry Ford II, and Henry said to Walter, how are you going to get the robots to pay union dues? And Walter Reuther said, how are you going to get them to buy your cars? It's the same argument that we're dealing with today. So the question becomes, and I think the argument and the mindset that Tim Fazio has, why he would invite me here today, because there's two ways to do this. You can bring people along or you can isolate them. So for example, I take a look at the Ed Renzi formula. I read the article in, what the hell's that magazine? The big Forbes, the Forbes magazine. What does Ed Renzi write? I don't want any of the state governments to put into place a minimum wage because as the CEO of McDonald's, all we'll do is we'll move to automation even quicker. Well, what a nonsense argument, because they're moving to automation anyway, but the flaw is you can't use the implementation, introductions of new technology and automation to be a weapon, because then workers are going to fight back and they're going to take you on. But the collaborative approach, or the more intelligent approach, is when you sit down to say, here's what's changing. Things are changing in an unprecedented manner. So how do we adapt? How do we make sure that workers feel that they can be a part of the solution instead of a part of the problem? Because when you talk to working class people about efficiencies, they view themselves as what's inefficient. So a person like myself is more concerned about companies that are not investing in new technology. Because if companies aren't automating, if they're not investing, then they lose all of the jobs because of global pressures.
Absolutely.
So if you understand and you work collaboratively with your workforce, it eliminates a lot of the fear. Because any corporation can write a big severance check. That's easy to do. The question is how do you transition the workforce? And I take a look at a lot of the economic models out there. I take a look at Germany. This isn't rocket science. You get the corporate community, you get the labor movement, you get the education facilities, you get governments, you get everybody in the room, you talk about the changing technology, and then we talk about how do we train our young people to cope with the change. Are the jobs going to be different? The answer is yes. The reason why so many people are afraid is I remember the arguments of the 1980s and 1990s when we were introducing mass-scale technological change within the auto industry. Manufacturing jobs went from about 20% and are now down to 10%. During that same time period, productivity in Canada was probably improved about 37%. Our wages went up 0. So the question doesn't become, are workers smart enough? 53% of Canadians have post-secondary education that are currently working. It's about 33% in the United States. So we're smart enough. It's a question of, is there the intestinal fortitude and the political will in order to engage people to deal with the change?
But you talk about the youth, which I always like to bring into these conversations because societies get defined by larger population bubbles, and the millennial bubble of employees, of workers, will define more of the societal norms going forward. And my sentiment, I agree with you when you think about bringing people forward and when you think about retraining and re-engaging in the conversation around work. But the millennial conception of work is very different than previous generations before, right? There is no concept of going to one job and staying there for the career. I interview millennials all the time, and they speak of jobs as projects, right? I did a project at this company, I did a project at this company. And so that concept, I'm highly optimistic from the point of view of millennials really embracing change, embracing retraining just as a part of work. And I think that there's a lot that we should be doing as an industry and a lot that we should be doing with all of our businesses to continue to engage, retrain, reskill, upskill. But I do think that there's a sort of a push in that direction from the population coming up.
Many of the millennials are looking at it that way because they don't have any choice. If I say to my kids, okay, here is a good paying, well-paid manufacturing job. There's going to be job security for 30 years. You're going to have a defined benefit pension plan. They're going to put up their hands and say, please, where can I sign up? The problem we've got...
That's not my experience with millennials.
Okay, well, anyway, we can agree to disagree, and it'll take a heck of a lot longer than we have in this panel. But the problem that people are dealing with today, as precarious, part-time, non-standard jobs are increasing at the rate of 3 times that of permanent jobs. So those are the economic realities that young people are dealing with today, and so they're coping with it the best they can. But I've yet to meet a young person that I've said to them, I have this good paying job, that you're going to have a good middle class job that's going to provide for your family, and you don't have to worry about whether or not you're employed or unemployed over the next 30, 35 years. Others, I can't generalize. Not everybody's like that, but.
Amar, go ahead.
I was just going to say, common to what both of you guys are saying is the inherent training or learning that has to happen, whether it's somebody moving from project to project or your existing worker learning a new skill. And I think the challenge is just the speed at which technology disseminates and the speed at which people get re-educated need to be somewhat in sync. Because sometimes, like that graph that Tom showed, which is things move slowly and then suddenly, you need to be very cognizant of how quickly technology disruption can happen. Otherwise, even with the best intention, you can end up with your workers being on the other side of the technology curve. So I think one of the things, I agree with you, that people need to really engage their teams in reskilling and re-educating them. But the time was not today, the time was yesterday. We really need to have that business and government push to get people educated faster in the newer.
Yeah. Does anyone here think that our educational system and our vocational training system is up to the task of preparing people for the cobot world or retraining people when they're disrupted?
I mean, one of the principles of building great software, just to put it out there, is that the end user is your North Star, right? The person using the technology is your North Star. And so one of the things I do think is important in the discussion is to say, as you build software for workers, it's meeting them somewhere in between. Right? It's not that the worker has to have 100% of the change and the technology is going to come in a really irrelevant, unusable manner, right? So both come part way. So I agree that there's absolutely imperatives around retraining and reskilling, but the software that succeeds and the software that's the best in the world is intuitive, easy to use, great interface, accessible on any device. It gives me a lot of flexibility with the usage patterns that I already know.
And Scott will probably have a manufacturer's view of whether vocational schools are meeting your needs or our needs or not. But just empirically, there's 2 million manufacturing jobs that are open, and there's something about why they are not filled today. I think it indicates that the education system hasn't caught up to what the needs of modern manufacturing companies are. And my intuition is that it's not there yet, but I think people are starting to try and accelerate that process.
Scott, would you like to comment?
No, I think he's right. I mean, to me, I hear all about retraining, and in a lot of places, I'd like to have workers to train, right? There's a whole swath of people we can argue the socioeconomic regions, again, longer in this panel, that feel like they were almost forgotten by an economy. And those people are almost unemployable now. Right? Whether it's they can't pass drug tests, whether it's they can't, show up consecutively for several weeks. Several places in the United States and moving actually into other countries. I mean, if you look at unemployment rates in Mexico right now, we talk about Mexican economy, it's sub 1% in most of the places in Mexico. So even finding workers in Mexico is very challenging to work in urban environments and that are trainable. So I think we've got to figure out how to not only start earlier. I think we talked about with the vocational schools, but also find out how we can take people that have been unemployed for several years and make them employable in these jobs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Does that category of workers who in the past it might have been because of possibly lower cognitive abilities or dysfunctions of one sort or another were harder to employ, is that situation getting worse with automation and so on?
Possibly. I think there's glimmers of hope, right? If you I was actually at a charity event on Saturday talking about spectrum disorders, right? And there's a lot of studies coming out where people with spectrum disorders that, back in the 50s would be unemployable in an institution somewhere. In certain roles, they're actually much more productive and much more skilled than other people. So I think there's a swath of workers and a better understanding of psychology and human intelligence that'll come from artificial intelligence around education that will help mitigate that. But how fast that moves, I don't know.
Jerry, maybe if you could comment on this. Your organization covers a broad cross-section, right, of people in the Canadian society. Do you see any trends in their retrainability or in their suitability for the jobs that are available in the future?
Well, it all depends on what the jobs are. I mean, people are absolutely trainable. They just need the opportunity. Like, let me give you an example of how things are changing and how we're not adapting or reacting, in my opinion, intelligently. The number one industry in Canada right now is retail. Predominantly minimum wage, low-paid workers. So if working class people in manufacturing facilities, for the purpose of the argument, know that the mass implementation of automation is going to lead to job loss, and the number one industry out there is retail, which means they're going to a low-wage job, then people are going to react. So when we're in these types of situations, you got to think big. And if there's ever a time for the corporate community, the labor movement, the education facilities, like I said, governments to come together is now. And let me give you an example. I'm an aerospace worker. I'm a sheet metal worker. I'm clock number 28091. And when we had mass layoffs at de Havilland Aircraft, which is now Bombardier, in the late 70s and the early 80s, back in those days, we used our unemployment insurance in Canada, not only just to give people a crutch when they got laid off to get themselves over the proverbial economic hump, but the government at the time said to the education facilities, to the corporations, where are the next skills needed? So our unemployment insurance fund was used to keep people in school for 2 years and 3 years. They didn't have to worry about getting a basic income while they were being retrained. And then when they graduated, they had real jobs. So it's a question about what are our political priorities? Because there has to be, if in fact we're going into a world where we're going to continue to invest in automation, that's a good thing. But we have to make sure that we have a plan as a society that you're not going to leave people behind or they're going to fight it every inch of the way. And so that's why I'm saying my concern is with the companies that don't invest, because that becomes a bigger problem. So there has to be a balance, I will argue, between raw capital and the social responsibility. Let me give you an example, if you don't mind, with some of the challenges that I'm dealing with now. I take a look at one of Tim Fazio's former companies in Pictou, Nova Scotia. It's the major mill. It employs 12% of the people in the community. It's now owned by Paper Excellence. It's about 250 jobs. It's called Northern Pulp. If you can imagine, the 250 jobs in that mill feed 1,000 jobs within the community. You take that mill and those other 1,000 jobs out of the community, you've got that mass devastation. So what's the argument we're dealing with now? We're dealing with the fact that you have a company that wants to put in a water treatment center because the waste is going into Boat Harbor, and you've got the environmentalists and everybody yelling and screaming, say, shut down the mill. I don't buy the argument that the question is either jobs or the environment. I think there's a way we can do both. So even when there's a plan, even then when you got a corporation that's willing to invest the capital and you got the labor movement that's prepared to move forward, you run into all these obstacles for people that say you can't do both. So this is a pretty complex discussion.
Sheila, let me broaden that complex discussion in one dimension. You invest in this space, in businesses that are taking advantage of the opportunities and addressing these challenges. I get the sense, not knowing the space well enough, that it's a little different than maybe some private equity investing in manufacturing businesses, right? What do you see in terms of the opportunities and challenges as an investor amidst this automation trend?
Absolutely. So we're venture capitalists. So we often invest earlier than private equity, and we invest only in software and data businesses that really enable all sectors, including the industrial sector. And I'd say the biggest opportunity that we see right now is taking people who truly understand the domain, i.e. are experts in the particular scenario that you're going after, and then mixing them with the expert technologists and the people that understand sort of cloud computing up and down the stack, data first computing, things of that nature. So as an EG, we look at supply chains and how you really take sort of supply chain innovation to the next level, and spent years really trying to find sort of direct procurement optimization, direct BOM optimization, find a business that could do that. And we ended up with the gentleman that really reinvented how Cisco did their direct procurement, and then really took him to the next level by helping him scale an organization that invests behind direct procurement scenarios for that community, right? And that community is now at the center of a conversation around cognitive sourcing. So AI for procurement professionals and AI for enabling your supply chain. And the most important thing to any of these businesses is that you know your customer. Well, it helps if you are your customer, that you build great technology for that customer that's intuitive, that's easy to use, that you can just start working immediately and see real value out of. And that technology is leveraging and using AI to make procurement professionals more intelligent, right? Leveraging a vast amount of data, leveraging information across a set of companies, not just my organization that I work at and get to see, but anonymizing that data and then allowing me to have the best insights of my whole industry. And so for us, a huge part of the imperative is really understanding, knowing, and coming from the industry that you're actually trying to help and augment.
We have about 10 minutes left in the session. We maybe have received some questions from the people in the audience. Let me check the monitor here. Yep, indeed we have. Jerry, a question for you. Do you see American labor having anything to learn from its Canadian counterparts?
Okay. So you don't want me to be truthful, obviously. Okay, I'm kidding here. Look, I think it's fair to say that, whoa boy. Okay, I'm just going to be candid, screw it. Look, I think we're a lot more aggressive in Canada as a labor movement than we are in the United States. The labor movement in the United States is probably sitting at single digits as it relates to representation. So even though the labor movement in the United States may be sitting at about 9%, apparently they get about 90% of the problems, or 90% of the blame. In Canada, I think we're a little more visible, we're a little more vocal. Like, I had no problem playing a very active, visible role in the renegotiations of NAFTA. Why? Because NAFTA is 24% of the world's GDP. I was the only labor leader that was there working with the Canadian team. So look, from the labor movement's point of view, whether or not it's in Canada or the United States, we've all done a great job of standing outside and yelling at the walls. Look, I look at things a little differently here. And that's why I'm quite candid about not being afraid of the implementation of new technologies. I'd rather be inside the walls. Whether or not you like what I say, that's a subject for a different day. But the simple reality is I'd rather be a part of the equation, because then I'm not always a part of the discussion. So do I think we're more aggressive than many within the labor movement here in the United States? The answer is yes. I think labor leaders, whether or not you're in Canada or the United States, should retire at age 65. I think having a bunch of labor leaders that are 72, 73 years old standing in front of young people say, follow me, doesn't work. So I think that whether or not it's the corporate community or the labor movement, it's best for us to move out of the way and turn the reins over to young people as we move forward into the next generation.
I have another question here. If a company's going to advance with automation, don't you think it's the company's responsibility to retrain? What about that question? Whose responsibility is it, and who has the ability to drive the retraining?
Let me try. I mean, like everything, ultimately the responsibility for retraining lies with the individual. I mean, you cannot shirk from that. However, it is a responsibility, and this is my opinion, I mean, I'm not like, so it is the responsibility of the company and of the community, if you will, to create the right set of circumstances and incentives for people to retrain. I mean, I think that if I've had to whatever, and I know people that have had to sort of relearn things over the years several times, and my employer had a lot to do to encourage me or give me the facilities to go retrain, or the encouragement or the project to go relearn what I needed to do. But ultimately, the responsibility, I believe, lies with the individual. So in a very absolute way, I'd answer that question. But I think that it begins with the company setting the context, setting giving the right set of incentives, and creating the right kind of environment in which somebody can retrain themselves.
Jerry, what portion of the responsibility can be shouldered by the people who work in your represented organizations, and what's the role of other parties that needs to be played too?
Well, first of all, just to follow, I think people need to be more proactive. It's not a question of having the discussion on training at the time that it's needed. It's about sitting people down in a room to say, here's where there are the changing trends. Here's where the technology is heading. So we start to train people, involve people in the discussion at the earliest phase. Because if at the end of the day, the employer is saying to the employee, go get trained on this now, or your job is gone, then they're going to go get trained now, but you might end up training the wrong people.
Yeah.
Because you've missed the opportunity for the overall engagement. So as an organization, listen, we just had a convention a few months ago, and it was on new technology and automation. So it's not as an organization that somehow we're afraid of it or we're running away from it. As a matter of fact, we know that there's going to be examples where there will be a negative impact on jobs overall, but I also look at it, frankly, as an opportunity to create different jobs. Yes, if you're going to put in new machinery that's going to take away some jobs as it relates to assembly, manufacturing, I can walk into a whole host of things. Yes, it may eliminate those jobs, but it creates different ones. Somebody's got to build the machine. Somebody's got to do the preventative maintenance on the machine. Somebody's got to program the machine. Somebody's got to run the machine. So it's a question of engaging people to eliminate the fears. Because when people are not feeling as if they're a part of the discussion and somehow they're an afterthought, then that's when things, in my opinion, tend to get screwed up.
I had an interesting mentoring conversation today. It's a little bit higher level than some of the work you're talking about, but it was interesting. So I hired a Duke MBA about 2 years ago, and he wanted to do strategy stuff and what they want to do, right? A Nigerian guy with a wife and young family, In the process of getting his green card, this is when a lot of stuff was going on in Trump, it went sideways, right? So I wanted to keep him employed. I said, look, you can't work in the US. I go, but I can move you to Guadalajara. I've got an incredibly growing operation there. So that was a year ago exactly, and I just had my mentoring conversation. I had him speak to all my direct reports because I put him in a role working with new product introduction on a line in a factory in Guadalajara. He's got twins that are 22 months old that are now fluent in Spanish. His wife's fluent in Spanish. He's learning Spanish. And he's got 6 job offers around the world in my organization because he's got so much practical experience. Now, if I had gone to Duke and I had a drink with him and said, you're going to go and you're going to work for 18 months in a factory in Mexico, to really learn how we do things around here in kind of, I don't want to say the old school way, but the way it was in maybe the 50s in the US, and then you'll be trained to go take on anything else around the world, he would have gone somewhere else, right? So we've got to change a little bit, the mentality of what training is and what experience is, because I think the script is not the same as it was in the 50s, 60s, 70s. And millennials want something different. And I think they want experience and they want opportunity, but they want it all in a little glass jar in front of them, right? They don't want to go somewhere else and find it. And I think that's a big part of probably the responsibility of the worker. And it's the responsibility of the company to, if they are willing to go outside that box, to give them that opportunity.
Yeah. Just so you know, in your app, if you reopened it, if you're able to open it, there's a poll question that you can take a live poll here right now, and it's on this topic or a related topic. Who should pay the price for retraining workers as technology reshapes jobs? And gives you some choices and things you might respond to. If you have a moment, go do that, and I'll come back to it at the end here. We've got a few minutes left. I'd open the floor for things that people have wanted to say, but I didn't give them an opportunity. And I'll tee up a question in case you want to address this. You heard earlier today there's people in this room that represent something like 2% of the productive economy of America with the people that they work with and the companies that they're involved in. What one piece of advice would you want to give them leaving here about something they should do this week, this year, right, to begin moving in the right direction to address this topic?
I'll go first.
Sure, please, Sheila.
My advice is just to really embrace technology, right? And embrace it in the context of how it can transform and transition your business. I think you'll see that change both top line and bottom line outcomes. And really think about software and data as your very close friend. And then think about, the employee that he just spoke of as potentially the next person starting the company that's really going to serve that line that he's serving on today through software and data and through innovation. And so just the embracing of innovation while embracing your workers, while embracing the skills that move things forward, while embracing the next generation of skill sets. So it is, as you say, people to program, people to understand your data, people to really work with your machines in a hands-on way, but also to really think about that next generation of skill sets for your organization, which again, I would say, allow workers the access to help retrain themselves, leveraging the internet, leveraging different sort of online medium that your company can provide. And I think that there's a real marriage of these things coming together, and kind of a brighter future on both sides.
I think the discussion we've had is, and I've raised it earlier, you got to think big. And the focus of the panel and a lot of the discussion was being technology is changing, it's changing rapidly, so we need to embrace it as we should. But as you embrace the changes that you will be implementing from your level within your facilities, have the same courage as you're talking to your own employees about their ability to adapt. And your point was absolutely dead on. The more you sit down with people and you say, here's what the challenges are, here's what the opportunities are. Because it all depends how you spin it. If people see that it's going to be a challenge and it's going to be a negative opportunity or a lack of opportunity, the reaction is one way. But if it's explained as it should be, that this is an incredible opportunity, and we know that you have the skills and the ability to come along for the ride, you will find that the reaction will be much different. Listen, as a labor leader, I would much rather sit down with the corporations that I have we have over 3,000 collective agreements in Canada. I would much rather sit down early in the stage to say, here's where the business is heading, or here's where the changes are within our air traffic controllers or within our airline workers. I'd rather have the discussion up front so that we can have a collaborative response.
Do you want to say something?
Yeah, I think what you'd said about embracing the talent and letting them run, I absolutely agree, right? And I think scoping the opportunity. I think especially in automation and artificial intelligence, this is it feels big and transformational, but it's really incremental, right? And what I find is our people aren't taking enough of a logical, objective approach. And if you empower the people, and in most of my facilities, I have 14 different facilities, I empower the functional management team and the workers themselves to prioritize a list of all the things they could automate. So you're giving the workers the opportunity to say what they think they shouldn't be doing or don't want to do. Then you run a quick ROI model on that and you start investing. That empowerment loop really starts taking off. So the workers see something they identified was funded to be automated. And now they don't look at it like a lost job. They look at it like, wow, I'm really empowered to change my environment. I think taking the emotion out of it and realizing that you have to do objectively is the one thing that a lot of people miss. I think my piece of advice.
So I would agree with Scott. I mean, I think a lot of the change has to be driven incrementally, but I think it will build upon itself. There's a sort of a flywheel of change that takes place, and it starts slowly and kind of then accelerates over time. And I think when I think technology, automation, software, whatever word you use for it, the implication of it is, I think, huge. In the long arc of time, nothing about your company is going to look the same. Everything from its business model to its workforce to its impact, even its products, is going to change dramatically. But that change is not going to happen all of a sudden at once. It's going to be this sort of incremental thing that gains speed, and then the transformation is going to really accelerate. And I think there's a lot to be learned, I think from science in how to approach such a large-scale transformation. Science kind of sets itself up for incremental learning, right? It does a experiment, looks at the result, adjusts, improves, and then kind of, heads towards the final answer in those ever, accelerating steps. And I think when you're implementing this large-scale change of technology, of automation, you kind of have to instrument your organization, your team, your people, your, everything for that learning process, that whole sort of agility of implementing, adjusting, and then re-implementing. And I think if you can do one thing this year, I would make sure that you pick a meaningful project. Sometimes people use the word pilot, proof of concept. That's wimping out. I mean, take a real project that means something to you, put your best people on it. If you don't have the right people, get some, mix up the people in, there's a lot to be learned by sort of combining talent sets inside a team, but do something meaningful, instrument it to learn from it, and then look at the results, build on it, and drive forward. Because you're either going to drive the change or be driven by it. It's much better to be on the one side of the equation than the other.
You can see the result of the sense of the room here, right? Is first of all, almost everyone is looking to engage in this topic and not avoid it completely, which is good. It wasn't exactly a third rail after all. It looks like it's a solution existing between ourselves as the business leaders and the people we work with. Combination needs to come together, and it's interesting to see we're not all going to rely on the government to figure it out for us, which is good. Jerry, do you want a closing thought?
Look, there's a lot of money in this room, and there's a lot more money to be made. So there's going to be preoccupation with bringing your employees along to train and retrain. But there also has to be a solution for those that are left behind. Because if the solution for those that are left behind is so what, then I will argue that a lack of social responsibility creates much deeper systematic problems.
Yeah.
Just want to leave you with that thought.
Great. Thank you very much, panel.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Well done.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you, Jerry. Thank you. Sheila?